Dungeons, Dragons, and the games that include them. But talk about what, however? Well, I've been taking part in a lot more discussions about games. I've been going out of my way to answer questions or to give advice. Within my social circle, I've been playing and running games for the longest time, and I seem to have become kind of the go-to wizened old sage that you ask for advice when it comes to building your worlds, understanding your rules, or writing your adventures. I believe that before we can answer specific questions, such as how much gold is too much gold to allow your party access to, or how do we handle a min-maxer at the table that's been disrupting play, and instead we need to have a underlying philosophy. We need to understand our own relationship to the games that we play and the friends that we're sharing them. And so this acts as a place to collect a great many of my own thoughts, and I've decided to share them with the world in the hopes that something I have to say will be helpful to other groups out there. So to begin, what exactly is a tabletop role-playing game? I'll bet this is a question that a great many of us have had to answer at some point in time, but not many of us have had to sit and really consider the question to give a defined answer overall. For me, a tabletop role-playing game is always going to be a collaborative storytelling experience, which is to say, this is a story shared between everybody at the table, the Dungeon Master, the individual players. What separates this from theatre, acting, or improv is that we use a shared rule set to facilitate our gameplay. We use this to give ourselves structure and a defined playing field, so that we know that there is kind of a base level of the world upon which all of us are going to act and interact. So, what is the role of the Dungeon Master? Are you the world? Are you the vengeful god? Are you trying to kill your players? Or your characters at least? For the most part, I see the Dungeon Master's responsibilities as facilitating the shared narrative of the group. That is to say that you set the scene, lay the groundwork, but you don't have the sole responsibility of creating the story and having your players interact with it. You should be working with your players, creating a narrative through the inputs of the various characters, the backstories, the goals, the directions, and watching the changes that occur. You engage with the players and you reward them. But in order to give a reward, you need to first provide a mechanically and narratively engaging experience. Because the more challenging you find your gameplay experience, the sweeter your rewards will be. I believe that the Dungeon Master should learn the different player perspectives and the different player archetypes, and then assist the players by augmenting that group dynamic. And, most importantly, the Dungeon Master should be having some fun, because you're doing this as a game with your friends, hopefully for months or even years. And if you're not having fun, you're probably not playing the game quite right. So what is the role of the player in my eyes? This is where I probably diverge quite a bit from other Dungeon Masters and most players in general, in that I think of a game as a shared experience between Dungeon Master and the group, but that also means that the group shares a narrative with the other players. It is my expectation that a player character is going to engage with the game world, the systems, and the other players in the group. But what do I mean by that? Well, when it comes to engaging with the game world, this can be as simple as approaching a Dungeon Master before the game and asking, "Hey, I'm looking at playing a drow. I was just wondering, is there anything about the drow in your world which I should be aware of? Are there any interesting cultural elements that I could play up? Or are there any racial tensions with the other surface races which I can take on board before I create this character?" Engaging with the world and using that to influence part of your decisions. This also includes things like coming up with your own quest ideas, goals, developing your own resources, anything that allows you to interact with the world on a narrative level, above and beyond simply creating your character in a vacuum. I would say that recently I've noticed a trend towards play in games like Dungeons & Dragons, where players will create their character in a vacuum, and they will show up to play at the table without having ever spoken to a Dungeon Master about their character, at least beyond a race or a class, and have probably never talked about their character with the rest of the group. I, as a Dungeon Master, tend to enforce a slightly controversial ruling where I require most of my groups to get together in person for a session 0, We do this so that we can talk about what the players expect from a game, and what I as a Dungeon Master can do to create a world more interesting for my players specifically, but also because I as a Dungeon Master like to see the characters being created, not because I don't trust the players, and not because I'm worried about the balance of the characters. Instead, I like to see the characters as they're made because I like to see the decisions that are being made. I like to see, okay, you're picking an elf, but you're choosing this sub-race specifically. Why is that? What is it that draws you to a wild elf as opposed to a wood elf? Why haven't you considered dwarf? Okay, you've chosen a ranger, but have you considered the fighter? And if you have, what in the end pushed you towards the ranger? I like to ask these questions because it gives me fertile soil to work with when developing the world, and I find that the characters are going to be more rounded and robust, more interesting and engaging, and players will enjoy them over a longer period of time once they have answered a few basic questions during the character creation process. Most importantly, a player is part of a shared experience, that their individuality should augment and enhance the whole of the group. And so creating characters together helps to forge these bonds and build these connections before play even begins. You will find that if one player talks about making a cleric and another player talks about making a paladin, they will very quickly have a discussion about, oh, what if we're part of the same god? You might even get the eye of the sorcerer who was considering a religious background, and now they're wondering, do I want to be from a rival sect of a different god, or do we want to theme ourselves around the worshippers of a single deity within our setting here? I think that group themes, or this slightly meta discussion about what the group sets out to do, will again create stronger bonds between your players and create deeper, more engaging characters which your players will enjoy over a longer period of time. Now, another slightly controversial position that I have in regards to players is that I expect my players to understand their own mechanics. I, as a Dungeon Master, even running a single game, let us assume for a moment that I'm only running 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, I have to learn effectively all of the magic items, most if not all of the monsters. I need to learn how treasure distribution works based on level, balancing the challenge rating of monsters and XP rewards for quests and kills, in addition to any role-playing bonuses in regards to the players' levels, and then I'll have to take into account the players' differing levels if they've scattered off into a different level distribution. There's a lot on your plate as a Dungeon Master, and I think that it is a small ask to expect that your players will have read the core rules of how combat will work, how skill checks will work, how inspiration would work, to know which of their attributes do what, and which of their abilities, spells, racial abilities do what, so that they can, if asked, explain to it, or even teach it to the rest of the group. I see it as the player controls their player solely within the game, therefore they should have a good groundwork of everything that their character can bring to the table, and even be able to assist others in understanding some of their characters. That this is again a shared experience, and that by each person taking on a portion of the responsibility, you end up with a fairer distribution of preparation and engagement to the entire group. This applies also to the narrative. I love when I can have a big bad villain come from a player's dark, morbid backstory, when a player can find the Thalia heirloom sword that was lost in these crypts 3 generations back, and when your sorcerer can track down the slayer of their mother when they were born and finally take revenge of their family. But each of these things has to be treated as something of a group experience. Everybody should have the spotlight on them from time to time, but the group overall should be the core system of measurement when we are thinking about the interactions between a player and the Dungeon Master. It is not the player, it is the players, the group. The Dungeon Master and the players form the group, and it is this shared experience, which I believe I'm harping on quite a bit by this point, that allows you to have a more robust and fulfilling experience overall. And finally, your players, they have to have fun. You are again going to be playing these games with your friends for years to come. Hopefully you will find and you will forge friendships that will last you the rest of your life through these gaming sessions. Years down the line, you're going to be sharing memories of these gaming experiences with people. You're going to be recreating characters and have a shared history, that experience. You're going off and you're adventuring. you're watching companions die, you're saving townsfolk and routing the armies of the evil king. You are creating an epic, and this is something that is special, and that it is difficult to do if you are only coming to the table to swing your sword, gain your XP, and go home to level up. I think that the more you put into a game, proportionally, the more you will receive from a game. And so I encourage my players to be a lot more proactive in the content that they suggest. I actively ask my players to suggest content, quests, ideas that they have, goals that they would like to do, places they would like to see. I, at one point, would poll my players quite extensively, but I have, in recent years, simply sit down and have a conversation. Tabletop role-playing games are a social experience. It is our shared experience that creates magic. So now that we've covered what the game is, how we define our Dungeon Master, and what we expect of our players, I think we should touch a little bit on how I approach Dungeon Mastering from a large overall level. Now, you'll notice that I'm trying to keep all of this advice fairly high level and abstract so that this applies to multiple game systems. I think that once you have a core philosophy and how you approach gaming as a whole, it shouldn't matter what game you come across, or you'll still be able to solve certain challenges that may arise, and you will have a consistent experience for the people that play with you. So, the first thing that I do with a Dungeon Master is I like to plant seeds. I like to have a whole list of little quest ideas and side plots and directions you can choose to go without expecting the players will ever go there. This does not necessarily mean that I am pre-writing pages upon pages of content, but instead I am seeding the world with seeds. That's the very definition of the word. I am waiting to see what the players express interest in, so I know which seeds are going to grow into plot threads. I believe that a Dungeon Master should provide a challenging experience, and this is, at its core, because I believe a reward that you have to work for is going to taste all the sweeter. It might seem nice at the start to rock up to a game and have a whole pile of magical items and tons of gold given to you, but after a few sessions of play, you'll start to realize there's no real challenge. You walk into every room, you slay all the monsters, you never go beneath half health, and your overall experience lacks something. And that, I believe, the victory is going to be all the sweeter if you can put yourself through a challenge to get there. I also believe that players and their characters are going to grow, change, and develop throughout the play experience, and that I, as a Dungeon Master, should reward as well as encourage this action. I like to see players with goals, their own ideas for quests and directions and things that they like to do and make changes to the world. Then I like to reward players that can see these arcs to completion. There is a reason everybody loves the idea of the Fallen Paladin, not because we all like the edgy knight in black armor, but because we like to look at the hero in his righteousness and wonder, what has he gone through to bring him to this point? What has he had to do to cause him to fall from his paladin order? What has he had to sacrifice? And that creates a more interesting character to have seen that growth. Is the Black Knight going to fall further to evil and become a true villain? Or is the Fallen Paladin going to seek some kind of atonement and redemption, eventually take up the mantle of the light once again? Growth doesn't always have to be a single direction. It can be the twist, it can be the tug and the pull, back and forth. I try to approach my games today by thinking of certain memorable moments. I like to think of each scene as an opportunity for something people will remember and share as a story. With this in mind, I like to create flavorful NPCs when dealing with simple shopkeeps or a discussion with some folks at the tavern. Make them larger than life, make them grand. Think of it as, this could very well be the last time your group gets together to play. You should have this as a memorable session, and when you approach your gaming like that, you will find that over time, your group will have a great many memorable experiences and stories that they will be telling and retelling for years to come. And most importantly, I believe wholeheartedly that the players are the focal point of the adventure, if not the world. Without the players, there is no game. A dungeon master without a group of players is a wannabe novelist that isn't quite writing a novel. So a dungeon master who provides a game world and adventures which don't really take into account the players themselves and the characters they've created may as well be sitting at home and writing a novel. Instead, they're creating a bad game experience for a group of players which could be having a good game experience with another dungeon master. So, this doesn't mean that the world revolves around the players, but from a narrative standpoint, as far as I'm concerned, the world ends with the players. Anything beyond the next horizon doesn't need to exist until the players go there. I like to create the illusion that there is a wide-branching world, but in reality, everything focuses around the group at play. So the next topic is basically summed up as the fluidity of our mechanical framework. And that's a really fancy way of saying the rules can be changed, and that in general, your narrative is going to trump the rules. Now, not every rule should be changed, but at the end of the day, any rule can be changed. So what do I mean by this exactly? Well, let's take monsters for example. I might have an adventure which calls for a whole lot of goblins, but I have only miniatures for kobolds. Now, I can go and change all the stat blocks, or I could simply put the kobolds down, call them kobolds, and use the stats of the goblin. I think that it is much easier to look at the statistics on any monster in the monster manuals and abstract the mechanics from the fluff to see each stat block as simply a stat block that can be applied to any creature of your imagination. You want to have a rock swoop down and decimate the party, but your party is low level and you don't necessarily want them to die in the first 15 minutes of the game. So perhaps you will look at a lesser imp or a mephit that has flight and small elemental powers, and you might be able to come up with a variant of a rock which is slightly smaller than the more traditional giant bird counterparts, but has been infused with elemental energy from the primal elements of the deep fade forests. I find that once you can free yourself from treating everything in the book as something that is sacred and must be kept as is, you are able to more dynamically react to your players and create content on the fly. You very quickly start to gain a gut instinct, a feeling for how a monster might balance compared to a group of your players' levels, or what kind of treasure feels about right for a lesser encounter versus what kind of treasure feels really good for a big horde at the end of a massive quest. At the same time, I am a big proponent that we can create new content for our player characters. That just because our player's handbook, assuming Dungeons & Dragons once again, says that all fighters are this way, there is nothing in the world to stop you at your table from rebuilding your fighter abilities, from creating new feats, from creating whole new archetypes, or if you have the time and you're willing to invest a little bit of effort into balancing, you can even create your own classes. And many different role-playing games over the years have had much more classes than 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons does now. There's 30 odd years of gameplay content you can look back on for ideas and inspiration, and you can see that people have been doing this since before many of us were born. Understanding and supporting your players. Players are equal, but that does not mean that all players are identical, and that every player is going to bring a unique interest, perspective, and style to the table. It's these diverse styles of different players which prove a great strength for the group overall, but there are a few problem elements that you should keep an eye out for. In general, I prefer to lift up as opposed to slap down, and I try to put myself between a problem player and someone who I'm trying to assist, as I can act as a bit of a buffer. If one player is consistently talking over the top of other players, for example, what I find is I will simply draw attention to the quieter players more consistently. The NPCs will ask them direct questions. I, as a dungeon master, will ask for their input at the start of an encounter or whilst moving through a wilderness. I try to get people engaged in that regard, as opposed to finding the loud player and trying to slap them down and punish them for something when I can more easily lift up other people to their level. Now, this isn't to say that every style is going to be falling into good and bad. There are a lot that are simply neutral. How do you rank somebody who likes to sit and draw maps? You can't, honestly. Some players will like it, some players will dislike it. I still have graph paper on my shelf next to my core rulebooks, which I'm used to using in nearly every game as a player. Granted, I haven't played in a number of years now, at least not consistently. Outside of the occasional demo, I have been the forever DM for forever. A lot of groups have difficulty trying to engage certain quieter players, and what you find is that there will occasionally be people that come to your table that aren't particularly interested. They kind of drift in, they sit quietly to the side, they'll say they're having a good time if you ever pull them aside and ask them, but they don't seem to want to engage too well. I find that this is honestly probably the most common thing that I have to deal with as a Dungeon Master, and my go-to technique when dealing with this kind of thing, as an example, is to get myself up and over there. Stand up, walk around the table. I Dungeon Master standing or walking more so than I do sitting these days. I got into the habit of it when I was running games at a local game store, and it was simply unfeasible for us to sit in the space and be able to relax. We were just too cramped, and it was too loud of a space for the other side of the table to hear me consistently, particularly if I wasn't raising my voice and straining my throat over the evening. So I got into the habit of standing up and walking around the table so that other players can hear me. What this slowly morphed into is that I would often walk around the table slowly, and the different sections would have themselves subdivided into different groups. The first two players might be off and trying to hack through the security systems of this Imperial starbase, whilst the next two players are currently trying to avoid detection from stormtroopers on patrol as they're trying to acquire one or two specific items from this Moff's personal library. And then the final group, on the third side of the table, are handling the drop-off and escape ship and trying to coordinate when no two of these groups can actually hear each other in any detail. And what this was creating in the end was situations where players simply could not metagame, and it provided an interesting experience. It was almost like I had three groups in 3 rooms. But most importantly, it simply gave me the habit. To draw this back to our shy, quiet player, get yourself up and walk around the table. Sit next to 2 players, sit between them, look at their character sheets, ask them about their abilities, say, hey, that's cool, have you considered using that ability yet? I don't know. Give it yourself a shot. Do you have one player that's constantly telling another one what to do? Sit between them for a little bit. Talk to the quieter, shyer player, or probe questions and distract the more boisterous and loud player. Try to get yourself out and on the other side of the DM screen. You shouldn't be thinking of that as a wall that separates you and the players. You are, the group players are on one side, Dungeon Master's on the other side, but you are all one group for one shared experience. And it is learning the different types of players that you have and supporting them in their growth in their gaming experience that can help them to grow in other aspects of their life and can really make a change. This is honestly where I believe the true educational power of a role-playing game lies. Not in terms of teaching, but in terms of allowing people to develop a more robust personality by engaging in aspects of their personality at the table which they might not otherwise get the chance to do in their day-to-day lives. There are a great many more thoughts that I have in regards to tabletop role-playing games, and even on the topic of a core shared philosophy that you can spread across all of your different gaming experiences. But I would like to keep tonight's video somewhat concise, and so I would just like to share a couple of closing thoughts, as well as a big thank you to the many people that have been pushing me to try and record videos like this for a while now. I do have a fair bit of anxiety and apprehension about putting this out there. It is difficult to take your voice, let alone a face and a name, and put it there to be judged by the whole of the internet. But I do hope that something in this has been of help to you and your groups. And if you would like to hear anything more in regards to these topics or on other topics, then please do let me know down in the comments below. If you have enjoyed this type of content, please let me know. Throw down a comment, give me a like, share it with your friends, talk about it in a Facebook group. I'm not really fussed. I'm not going to beg for shekels or anything like that. I just hope this has been some use to somebody. At the end of the day, all I like to do is see the world filled with more games, more friendships, and more good experiences. I like to fill my own life with these things, and I would wish it upon everybody else. My hope is that I can take more of my thoughts and pieces of advice and build this channel up as a good hub of support and community, but that's simply long dreams. So again, thank you if you've managed to make it this far, and I hope that you've enjoyed listening to me at least for a little bit. Take care. We'll see you next time.